What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another episode of the best armies in Warhammer 40k, the weekly video series where we go through undefeated results from the past week of competitive events and talk about what's currently winning. And it's a weird week this time around because about midway through last week, we saw a big balanced data slate, including some new releases and rebalances to a lot of the existing factions. That means that this week, the event results were split by about 50-50. About half of the larger events of the weekend used the new data slate versus about half of them, and especially the larger events like majors and super majors, typically had rules cutoffs that were prior to the release of that update. So this week, what we're going to be doing is focusing on the events that did use the most current version of the rules. Now, I will note in here that there are still some things that are as yet unavailable. So units like the new characters for Tyranids and Leagues of Votann, as well as Tau Empire, were not used in these tournaments. However, we did get a sneak peek at what the metagame could look like using existing units. So with that, we did dig a little bit deeper than we typically do into these events and talk about some events that don't usually fit the normal selection criteria for the events that I talk about on this channel. And going through a metagame breakdown, we can see that Necrons have survived their nerf, taking down the Warp Spring GT with a Cursed Legion build. Adepta Sororitas won the Pacific Northwest Warlords Spring GT. Blood Angels won the Team Wales 40k. Emperor's Children took down the Iberian Crypta de los Heros. And Astra Militarum won the Torneo Art Hobbies event. Now, that was a little bit of a weird one because it did actually have, it went apparently 4 rounds, so it ended with 2 undefeated. But like I said, we're going to be digging a little bit deeper than we typically do. In this case, one of those undefeated was Tyranids, who went 4-0-1, but the event used differential scoring. One of those results, in fact, in the final game was a 5-point win for the Tyranids, which was reported as a draw, but is a win if you use raw scores, so we're going to include them as well. But Tyranids also won the Triple Cities GT with 2 separate detachments, so we'll talk about both of those this time around. Moving on to lists, let's move over to the Warp Spring GT. This was a 30-player event being held in the United Kingdom, and as such was using UKTC rules and terrain. In this case, it was won by Adam Merritt, who is running a Cursed Legion detachment. It seems like the Catan Shards have survived their recent nerf and resurrected themselves to the front line of the dynastic hosts, since this list was including 3 of them, the Deceiver, Nightbringer, and the Void Dragon. We also saw a couple other characters, including a Hexmark Destroyer, a single Scorpic Lord with no enhancements, and an Overlord with a Destroyer Ankh. Now, this was a Resurrection Orb and Void Scythe Overlord, not one of the Translocation Shroud Overlords. Interesting, no use of Amintar, but that's because, obviously, he did just get a big nerf where he no longer affects Catan Shards with his auras. So if in an army where we are spending about half of the points value of the army on Catan Shards themselves, having a character who does not buff them is not quite as useful. Now, in this case, we are taking a bunch of utility units, including 3 individual Locust Heavy Destroyers, all of those with Gauss Destructors, as well as a single individual Locust Destroyer, plus a unit of 5 Flayed Ones, a unit of Ophidian Destroyers, and 3 units of Scorpic Destroyers to make use of the extra strength from the detachment ability as well as their stratagems. Now, last and certainly not least is a unit of Dispersion Shield and Hyperphase Sword Lichguard. That's for the Destroyer Ankh Overlord to hop into in order to give them additional speed and access to strats like Advance and Charge, which is pretty helpful for the unit. This is a little bit of a different variety of Necrons. We have seen similar builds of Cursed Legion do well in the past, although obviously we are going to be still falling back onto those Catan Shard profiles. Pantheon of Woe did get some massive changes to its points value. However, the overall cost of these units did not change significantly outside that detachment, so their use in multiples in different detachments does still make a lot of sense. Now, moving on from there, let's talk about the Pacific Northwest Warlords Spring 40k GT. This was a smaller 24-player event that was using Chapter Approved 2025 terrain layout, and it was won by Ken Bush, who was running Bringers of the Flame Adepta Sororitas detachment. This is the very fast detachment, gives you access to extra strength and assault on your ranged weapons on your units, which allows you to project a massive amount of aggression in the early game. In this case, we're running Morven Vol in addition to a trio of Immolators. Those all are equipped with multi-meltas, no Immolator Flamers there, as well as a Rhino. With a single unit of Arco-Flagellants to act as utility, in addition to 3 Castigators, all of those with the twin-linked autocannon profile on the turret weapon, none of them with the battle cannon. We did have 2 Dominion squads. These guys can combat squad into the Immolators to grant all of those Scout, in addition to 2 Retributor squads, a Seraphim squad for deep striking, and a Sister Novitiate squad. Now, the Novitiate squad can also combat squad inside the Immolator to give you a 5-model utility unit, an infiltrating unit that you can use to screen or to hold objectives in the early game, and another unit that can then disembark an Immolator and act as utility later on. The Retributors can be delivered either by the Immolators after their Scouts disembark or the Rhinos. And in any case, you can use advance and disembark on these units after they scout move, so they have a prodigious threat range out of the first turn, especially with those Dominion units. The Dominion squads, I should mention, also are bringing all Melta weapons, so an Infernal Pistol on the Dominion Superior, as well as Melta guns on the Dominion squads themselves. So we're able to auto 6 advance them if you roll high enough on our Miracle Pool in the early game, push them forward 6 inches from a scout move, advance them 6 inches, and then move them 12 for a 24-inch movement on the top of the first turn, plus a disembark to get multi-Meltas and Melta shooting into your opponent's deployment zone. That's an incredibly scary prospect, and then that can be followed up by the Castigators. We also have Morven Vol in here alongside the Paragon Warsuit squad for her to go into. That unit gets to be relatively speedy thanks to the assault from the detachment ability, so they can get weird angles with Morven's missile launchers as well as the multi-meltas from the Paragons themselves, and they act as a pretty good anchor for the army in the late game. So you have a massive amounts of aggression in the early game from all of the Dominion squads in their Immolators. The Dominions can also react to move back into the Immolators as the game progresses. You can then follow that up with the Castigators popping out and shooting. They get the access to ignore cover from the mass number of Immolators in the army already, and then can provide that +1 AP, which could potentially go on the Melta guns from the Retributors or the Dominion squads. So it's just overlapping layers of aggressive close-range shooting that you're just going to be able to pound your opponent into dust with. Now that moves us over to the Team Wales 40k GT : Game of Thrones fundraiser. This is a smaller event, only 19 players. Typically, we do tend to talk about larger events in this series, but like I said before, we were looking specifically for events that did use the new updates. And in this case, it was a 5-round event using WTC terrain layouts. This was won by Fernando Soriano, who was playing Blood Angels using Rage Cursed Onslaught. It's back. I don't know if it ever left, but here it is. Being led by none other than Astorath the Grim. He did get a little bit of a cut in the last update, so hopefully we will see his inclusion in armies a little bit more often now. Now, in this case, we were running a Blood Angels captain with the Angel's Fang, as well as a Jump Pack chaplain with Master of the Red Thirst, as well as Lamarties and the newly upcharged combi weapon lieutenant. He's still making it into most lists that I looked at that were using the new points values, despite his now more expensive cost. Now, we had an intercessor squad for the back line, as well as 30 Death Company Jump Pack Marines. So we have an attachment available for the Jump Pack Chaplain, Lamarties, and Astorath. For Astorath to grant that fight on death, as well as devastating wounds. With the number of attacks that these units of Death Company can make, that devastating wounds can go pretty long way. Now, from there, we have a little bit of additional support from a pair of Sanguinary Guard units. Those are all equipped with Carmine Spears, bolt guns, and banners, with an Inferno Pistol on the banner bearer. One of those can be joined by the Blood Angels captain, but we then have another unit that's just going to be able to operate independently to act as a trading piece. Little unit of OC2 guys who can run around and knock out opposing utility units. We have a single scout squad, as well as a Stern Guard veteran squad, just 5 Stern Guard veterans in that one. I don't believe we have any attachments for them. There's no ground pounding characters, so they're just going to be hanging out by themselves, in addition to a Vanguard veteran squad with jump packs. Yet another nice little utility unit that can act as both with a utility squad with a little bit of survivability thanks to Storm Shields. Relatively standard stuff from Rage Cursed Onslaught, but the inclusion of Astorath to Grimm's kind of interesting. We do have that Master of the Red Thirst Jump Pack Chaplain, so he's going to get a once per game use of Fight First. We have use of Deathless Duty to fight on death naturally, and then Astorath also granting Fight on Death means that we can basically have all three of those Death Company squads reacting to enemies charging them. So if you can create a situation where you can keep your units on the table, advance and charge, or rapid ingress and then charge, and engage with several different Death Company units all at the same time, even if your opponent comes back and hits you really hard, Lamarty's unit might just live because he has -1 damage, and you can give them a 5+ Feel No Pain. You can get Fight First on the second unit and Fight on Death on a third unit for free, or pay the command points for a Fight on Death if you have the CP floating, which allows you to basically just swing a second time during your opponent's turn with almost 100% of your Death Company Marines, which is actually kind of crazy when you think about it. The fact that this is going to be an aggressive melee army that can basically activate again in your fight phase is absolutely horrifying. So cool to see these like lesser played characters now getting some time in the spotlight. Speaking of time in the spotlight, let's talk about one of the larger events on the roster for this weekend. The Iberian Crypta de los Eros, which was a 42-player tournament. The event was won by Ferran Villegas, who was playing Emperor's Children, but not any normal Emperor's Children that we've seen before. In this case, it was the Peerless Bladesmen detachment. This one's actually pretty cool because it's very straightforward and relatively powerful in its detachment ability. It just gives you lethal hits or sustained hits when you charge in the fight phase. So it's kind of like Dark Pact, but melee only, with a little bit of, I guess, not necessarily upside, because you don't have to make the Dark Pact check, but you only get it on charges, so kind of a side grade from Dark Pacts, I suppose. But given the fact that Emperor's Children is a high model count, relatively fast army, being able to get those charge bonuses is fairly consistent. In this case, we are bringing 3 Lord Exultants, all of them taking separate enhancements. One of them is bringing Blinding Speed, so that he gets a once per game use of Fight First. One of them is bringing Distortion, that's the attack and enhancement, gives you +1 attack and damage, affecting not only the spear for the Lord Exultant, but also his whip as well, so he gets 2 damage whip attacks with lethal hits and sustained hits thanks to the detachment ability. So when he charges, he's going to automatically grant his unit lethals, but then also get sustained, but then he also gets 3 damage attack from his spear, so he's actually just an insane amount of damage output. Almost full rerolls, sustained hits, lethal hits, and 8 3-damage spear attacks with lance is a lot going on with that guy. Now, last but certainly not least, we have 1 Lord Exultant with Rise to the Challenge. This is a bit of a lesser seen, very expensive enhancement that gives him once per game a Fight Again ability. It's basically real 9th or 8th edition energy from this one. It allows him to, at the end of the fight phase, if he is engaging 3 enemy models, not his unit, he himself is engaging 3 enemy models, he can use the enhancement to fight 1 additional time. And again, if you have used your once per game extra attacks and AP ability on the Lord Exultant there, you're going to get the benefit of that a second time. And because he already charged, if you did that on the turn that you charged in that same phase, then he's also going to get the access to that sustained or lethal hits. So he has some incredible potential to do insane damage. However, it requires an extremely specific matchup. You can't play against something that's particularly low model count, and it requires a very specific board state in order to use that ability. Now, there is a 6-inch consolidate effect inside this attachment, so you can sometimes create situations where his unit charges something, kills it, and then 6-inch consolidate so that he can get into engagement range with multiple enemies. Although whether or not he then ends the fight phase engaging them is questionable sometimes. So it's very difficult to pull off, but if you can do it, this guy can do absolutely crazy damage. Now, last but certainly not least, we have Lucius the Eternal and Fulgrim in the army. Fulgrim's nice in this detachment because he already has, I should say, sustained hits on his weapons, so he gets sustained and lethal hits from the detachment, and he can even improve his own AP characteristic with Cruel Bladesmen when he charges. We then have 3 Infractor units to attach to the Lord Exultant, in addition to a Tormentor squad for utility and OBSEC. We have Chaos Rhinos to deliver those guys, as well as the 2 units of Noise Marines in the army. We have a Chaos Spawn unit for some utility, as well as a Mauler Fiend. Now, the Mauler Fiend's great in this detachment because sustained hits on his big punchy melee attacks is always good. The Mauler Fiend innately can be a little inconsistent on his attacks, so getting sustained hits is always helpful for those big sort of anti-tank profiles. But the other thing, too, is that he's also eligible for Cruel Bladesmen. He's not really using a blade, but I guess that still works, in order to make him AP3. So he's better at punching through medium to heavy targets that oftentimes just save on 4s against him, and sometimes he can be very inconsistent into them. So very nice little combo here. Last and certainly not least is a unit of Flawless Blades. These guys did just get a points cost reduction in the new update, and the giving sustained hits to their attacks when they're anti literally everything in the entire game forever is very helpful, because extra hits on those things is absolutely horrifying. Same goes for Lucius the Eternal. If we can give that guy sustained hits, especially since he can get access to rerolls, Lucius can go absolutely insane. So that unit, especially if it's against any of Lucius's particular chosen targets, so characters, monsters, or walkers, are going to do crazy damage. They're going to represent an immense amount of pressure on the battlefield. So the other nice thing that this detachment can do that is unlike other Emperor's Children detachments, especially like things like Coterie of the Conceited, is that it doesn't have to gain coterie points. There's no pressure on the detachment to actually kill you in an efficient way, so it can play really aggressively. All of its Lords Exultant are basically full power from the start of the game, so you can pressure your opponent with your scout moving, infract your squads. You can push forward and start to clear them out with the Lord Exultants. That opens up space for the Noise Marines to continue to do some damage, and as well as a position for Fulgrim to rapid ingress in and get some work done alongside that Mauler Fiend. And then you can clean the game up with the Flawless Blades, who can kill basically anything else that's remaining. So it can play hyper aggressively, but it's also not really required to push forward. So if all you're doing is just clearing some screening units or some lighter units using your Norse Marines and keeping your infractors safe, it's not losing efficiency by failing to pledge or failing to get the pledge points that you would normally get for the Coterie of the Conceited. So it plays a lot more consistently. Obviously, the cap on power is much smaller than it is in Coterie of the Conceited, but every time you see one of those Lord Exultants hit with sustained hits and the distortion ability and +1 AP, it can be kind of crazy. These guys hit AP4 3 damage in some cases, which goes sort of hard. I've seen them one-shot even heavy tanks like Land Raiders and Rogaldorns with that one little character, which in this detachment is definitely possible. Now with that, we are moving over to the Torneo Art Hobbies Merida Marzo 26, which was won by Sebastian Flores Diaz running Astra Militarum. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, this event ended after 4 rounds, so it cut off a little bit early. It was 25 total players, and it was advertised as being 5 rounds, but I think they went to 1-4-0 and then called the event. If I had to guess, I don't know 100%, but that is what is reported on Best Coast Pairings. That said, we did technically have 2 undefeated players, and one of them with 4 wins on the record, although one of them was a differential draw. So we'll talk about that one momentarily, but we're going to start by talking about the Astra Militarum. Now, Sebastian is still on Grizzled Company. That has not changed, though we do see significantly fewer Rogaldorns with the new points cost improvement to those guys or points cost increase, I should say, than we did previously. In this case, we're running a single Ministorum Priest for some utility, I imagine. In addition to Akkadian Command Squad, a Commissar with a human detail. He's going to attach in with the Akkadian Command Squad to make use of their Master Vox. A Gaunt's Ghosts unit, as well as 2 Rogaldorn Commanders. Akkadian Shock Trooper Squad, so we can dual attach the Commissar and the Akkadian Command Squad. In addition to just a ton of hyper-aggressive infantry and cavalry. This is one of the most aggro Astra Militarum lists that I've seen outside of Recon Guard in a really long time. This includes 3 Chimeras that are embarking 3 units of Khazarkin, so we have access to those guys running up and disembarking. They can even get Master Voxed orders over from either the Gaunt's Ghosts if they teleport near them to get end-of-phase orders, or you can use Snap to it to order them in the shooting phase. So the Khazarkin they can't advance and disembark, so they're a little bit slower in the Chimeras than they are in an equivalent unit like a Torox. However, the Chimera itself is much more difficult to kill and mounts several heavy flamers. In this case, we were running a turret-mounted heavy flamer plus a hull-mounted heavy flamer, in addition to their lasgun arrays and their pintle weapons and their hunter-killer missiles. So the output from a Chimera is much higher, and they're much more difficult to kill, although they are slower. Once those Khazarkin drop out, they can Warrior Elite themselves for an order, and then you can snap to it to give one of those units a second order. So you can be +1 save from take cover or +1 to hit, in addition to +1 attack from the combination of take aim and first rank fire, second rank fire. So these guys can deal damage with Melt-A-Mines, and then they come in with Melt-A-Gun and Plasma Gun shooting in close range. Following that up are Bullgrin squads. There are 2 of those. They can get orders from the Commissar, who can issue them +1 to hit and melee fixed bayonets on those 2 guys, so they can sort of absorb the middle of the table. If anything gets through that, so a solid wall of Chimeras and Khazarkin and Bullgrin, we then have 10 Attilan Rough Riders who can come in as a late game counterpunch threat. Not a lot of utility or nuance here. This is just kind of a blunt instrument, but I guess that does befit the hammer of the Emperor that is the Astra Militarum. Now, with that, we're going to move on to second place in this event, also 4-0, but did not win the tournament. This is Jose Alfredo Cuchale, who is running a Subterranean Assault Tyranid build. This is the Tyranid list where you can go into tunnels, you build little tunnel markers around the table, and you can teleport your units either from them, 6 inches away from enemies, or between them. If you are wholly within 9 inches of a marker, you can appear 9 inches outside of another marker. In this case, we are running the Death Leaper for some early game infiltration, a unit of hyper-adapted Raveners. There are 2 standard Ravener squads in the army. Oftentimes, we'll see the hyper-adapted jump into one of the Ravener units. So in the early game, they can use their natural up-down to build tunnels in the back line, and then as the game progresses and moves on, they can hop out of one of those tunnels 6 inches away from enemies, potentially benefit from a charged reroll aura from a monster, and then get into melee. We have a Neuro Tyrant that is to attach into a big unit of Zoanthropes, as well as a Winged Hive Tyrant, and last but certainly not least, a Trigon Prime with the Trigon Prime upgrade to give him additional weapon skill and the Synapse keyword. From there, we have 2 units of Gargoyles. These guys are absolutely phenomenal in this detachment for their ability to hop out 6 inches out of a tunnel and then shoot something and move 6 inches. So they can basically almost set up outside engagement range of you because they're going to be 6 inches away from you and then move 6 inches towards you. So they're, unless you're really bubbling out your objectives in a huge way, they're just going to take them because they're all OC2. From there, we have a Bio 4 in order to score, plus a Lictor and a Neuro Lictor to go alongside the Death Leaper with some early game secondary scoring and primary control, alongside the 2 units of Raveners and the 6 Zoanthropes that I mentioned before, and last but certainly not least, 2 Norn Emissaries. The nice thing about the Norn Emissaries in this detachment is that you're able to deliver them directly to their chosen objectives. So at the beginning of the game, you'll choose a singular purpose objective, and one thing that can oftentimes happen is that the Norn Emissaries get caught without being in range of that objective, in which case it means that their OC characteristic is reduced and they don't get a 5+ Feel No Pain. And when you've attacked a Norn Emissary without the benefit of its singular purpose bonus, they die immediately. They're not that hard to kill. However, once they get that Feel No Pain, they're such a boatload of wounds that they do become very sticky to remove, and they're very good at holding that primary. Obviously, the downside of a lot of these the Subterranean Assault builds is that they're very good at delivering units to areas of the battlefield. However, Tyranid units don't tend to stick around very long. Norn Emissaries are the exception to that. They are very difficult to kill. They have a boatload of wounds. They can be a 5+ Feel No Pain if you get them to that objective, and they have a baked-in invulnerable save. So these 2 are going to hold down the midboard. If we need to, we can use Raveners to construct tunnels and then just teleport the Norns through the tunnels to the objectives that they need to be in. We have access to the Trigon, which can construct additional tunnels and even construct those tunnels closer than normal to enemies, because he can come in outside of 6 inches naturally, assuming we don't want to get a charge with him, but oftentimes we will. And then the Norn Emissaries can hold down the fort in the center of the table, while you have units like Gargoyles that can keep your opponent's score low, and you have the hyper-adapted Raveners and the other units jumping around that are going to be able to grab objectives in the back line. I should mention as well that a lot of this is facilitated by a Winged Hive Tyrant. This guy's much cheaper than the melee Hive Tyrant variant, although he doesn't hit as hard, and he's much easier to kill. He's physically larger, even though he has worse defensive stats, which is unfortunate, and he has less melee attacks. However, he's cheap, and he can mess with your opponents in melee, so if you are playing an aggressive list kind of like this one, he is helpful, but he's almost required, at least something like this is almost required, in order to keep this army fueled with command points over the course of the game, because if you don't have this, you're going to be using consistently up-down stratagems for your monsters or tunnel network to teleport things between tunnels, and if you don't have the Hive Tyrant to turn that on, you end up running out of command points very quickly. It's also nice that he's able to go through tunnels as well, so you can get him engaged in the late game, and he has 6 Twin Linked melee attacks that full hit and wound reroll, because he hits on 2s naturally, he doesn't bracket, and he gets reroll once they hit from the detachment ability. So he's very consistent with his melee profile, especially against like mid-weight light vehicles and heavy infantry. He really wants to hit that stuff. Overall, pretty cool list. A lot of times we see some builds that are like very focused on either the hyper maneuverable stuff in the Tyranid Codex, and sometimes we see stuff, builds for Subterranean Assault, that are focused very heavily on just shooting you with guns, just teleporting guns around the table. In this case, we're just punching people. we got Norn emissaries. We're gonna come down. We're gonna sit on objectives, and we're gonna back flank you with Raveners and stuff. And that's what we're doing, and it's pretty cool. Now from there, we are going to continue to discuss Tyranids and move over to the Triple Cities GT. This was a 39-player event using the WTC terrain layouts. In this case, it was won by Connor Reynolds, who also ran Tyranids. And this is a list after my own heart. It is an invasion fleet build. So the sort of core Tyranid detachment, where you can choose a keyword to get a bonus against. Infantry, you get sustained hits. Against monsters and vehicles, you get lethal hits. Against characters, you can get precision. Although usually it's either sustained or lethal hits based on your opponent's composition. And in this case, it was bringing a single infantry model, and everything else was a monster. It's one of the most straightforward lists of all time. It's the Swarm Lord, backed up by a Biovore to score some maneuver secondaries and construct some additional models for screening. He's basically required in armies like this, because otherwise your model count is so low that if you have to screen a corner from an enemy deep striker, you just can't do it. The rest of the list is just 3 data sheets, 3 Exocrines, 3 Maleceptors, 3 Norn emissaries. Fair enough. All of these having multi-damage, multi-shot blast weapons, getting access to those keywords. So if you're fighting against lots of infantry, having Maleceptors and Exocrines all get sustained hits is good. Their strength is not particularly high, so getting them all lethal hits against monsters and vehicles when you run into those matchups is great. And those additional keywords help out the Norn emissaries quite a bit. The Norns do have 10 melee attacks, so getting lethal hits with 10 melee attacks means you're going to be handing your opponent probably 1 or 2 wounds over what you would normally expect if you were swinging into a high toughness characteristic. Obviously, the strength is not super high, so if you're fighting heavy vehicles or something, there's a pretty strong, solid chance that they hit very consistently, they don't wound very well. But if you give them lethal hits, it shores that up quite a bit, and if they have to wade into an infantry swarm, getting sustained hits is a big deal too. The other thing is that you have rapid regeneration in this detachment, so you can give them a 5+ feel no pain naturally. So these guys, even if they're not on their singular purpose chosen objective, you're going to be able to protect them with a feel no pain, which you can't say for other detachments like the Subterranean Assault we just talked about. The other thing is that this army, it just has an immense amount of mid-board, like frontline presence. The Maleceptors and the Norn emissaries all have 4+ invulnerable saves. The Maleceptors then project their -1 to hit and potentially -1 to wound aura on enemies that are nearby. The Norn emissaries are protected by a Feel No Pain. In some cases, you can also apply the Feel No Pain to the other monsters if you don't need it on the Norn emissaries for that turn. And then you have the Swarm Lord, who, backing all of this up, is going to be projecting his Lord of Deceit aura to reduce the effectiveness of enemy stratagems in the center of the table. So this list is able to provide this massive just front line of super obnoxious to kill data sheets. And if you don't have the right profiles to get through all of that defensive technology, then you just can't kill them. The Norn emissaries are going to consistently outscore you. They're going to OC 15 the center of the table. You're going to not score any primary, and they're just going to bully you out. Very straightforward list. I love it. I love big monsters, so I'm a Timmy at heart, I think, so I do like this build. And with that, those are all the best armies of Warhammer 40k for this week. Let me know down in the comment section which one is your favorite. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everyone who supports Tactical Tortoise, whether that's over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All you people are cool, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.